Hello, Gr12s. Welcome back from the short break. It's Economics with Ms. Piwe. In this lesson, we are looking at the dynamics of the imperfect markets. And just before the ad break, we were looking at some points that would help us to understand what this imperfect competition is all about. And we are focusing on the monopolies because they are a good example of us, or they're a good example in helping us to understand the imperfect competition, because it's one business that hasn't got any competition, that provides a unique service, and also it has put measures in place to block other entrants to come into the market space. So therefore they dominate the market space, and therefore they're in a position where they can influence pricing as well. So let's continue with our lesson. So our last point was on the products, the fact that they are differentiated and they are unique. So monopolies manufacture a variety of products which are difficult for other companies to copy. So that's the last point that we mentioned before the ad break. So let's continue. So large amounts of starting capital are required. So large industries like Eskom and Sasol require millions of starting capital. So it's not easy to start these businesses. You can't just say or wake up, tomorrow and say, I want to replace Eskom and I want to be the next service provider when it comes to electricity. It's not that easy because of the large amounts of money that are required, or in terms of startup capital. And Eskom and Sasol are good examples of companies that require huge amounts of capital in order to be established. So that on its own acts as a barrier in the market because of the amount of money that is required in order to start those businesses. Another interesting point that we need to consider is the fact that monopolies, so I'm just going to pull my screen up, there we are. Monopolies have legal considerations, so this is quite important. So we're going to spend a bit of time just going over that so that we understand this clearly and so that we can do well in the exams if we are asked questions around this. So new inventions are protected by patent rights. So there are rights that are imposed on new inventions, and therefore this makes it difficult for new businesses to copy these new inventions that are manufactured or produced by the monopolies. Okay, so the patent rights are there to act as a barrier or to block other businesses or firms from entering this market. Services like the post office are protected by law, and other businesses are prohibited from entering the market space. Okay, so this could be a bad thing as well in terms of the quality of service that we receive from monopolies, because they know that they are in a protected space. So there isn't that pressure for them to continuously reinvent themselves so that they become appealing to the consumers. So they know that the consumer hasn't got any other options but to use their services. So they do use this to their advantage, actually. And sometimes they can sit for a long period, without going back to revise on their offerings or the products that they render to us as customers or consumers, because they feel that they're in a comfortable space where they are not challenged by any other businesses. It is also possible for the monopolist to make an economic profit in the long run. So we're focusing on the long run. This is because it faces no competition from new entrants as a result of the barriers to entry. So they can also make an economic profit because they have no competition, and they know that they've got such strong barriers to the market, and those barriers do block out the competition from coming into the market. So there will be no new entrants coming into the market space. Right, moving right along. So monopolies can be classified as two main groups due to the barriers that exist. So we know that we can classify them into two main groups. we've got what we call the natural monopolies. Okay, so high development costs prevent others from entering the market, and therefore the government supplies the product. For example, electricity in South Africa is provided by a government or by the government enterprise, which is Eskom. It costs billions of rands to build, maintain power stations, and therefore there are no other suppliers. So this will be considered as a natural monopoly based on the high development costs that are involved. And I know sometimes this has been on the news where they are talking about Eskom and how much more they need in order to build the next power station or the nuclear power station or plant that needs to be created. And when you hear those costs, you know, it's quite scary. You just imagine you wake up one day and you have all that money sitting in your account, then you know you'll be sorted for life. So there are huge amounts of costs that are involved in maintaining and building power stations around the country. And hence this makes it difficult for new entrants to come into this market space because of the costs that are involved in offering this particular service. And we know that the service is offered by a government enterprise, so they do get an injection from the government if they are not performing well in terms of revenue, but also if they need subsidies and they need to be sponsored to complete certain projects, the government will consider matching up those or taking over those costs of them building and maintaining power stations. And then the other group is known as the artificial monopolies. So the first one is natural, and then the second one is the artificial monopolies. Here the barriers to entry are not economic in nature. An example of a barrier is a patent, which is a legal document or legal rights over an invention or a product. So a patent is a legal and exclusive right to manufacture a product. So this actually already excludes other new entrants from entering into the market, because that particular firm or business has been given exclusive rights to manufacture a product, and therefore then you can't have substitutes because you know they need the legal rights in order to manufacture those particular products. So it does make it difficult for new competitors to come into the market space because of the patent rights that are imposed on these products, and they make it difficult for other people to manufacture. So they are not natural. It's not an economic thing, whereas this one is much more economic because there are huge costs that are involved. So it is an economic thing that you let a government enterprise run this in order to try and decrease the costs that are involved here, because then the government could subsidize some of the costs. So then we as consumers end up, saving some money, but with the way that the electricity price has been hiked up, I doubt that we are in a position of saving any money. But with the artificial monopolies, they are not economic in nature because you have more of a legal framework that is used to give one manufacturer exclusive rights to manufacture that product, thus making it difficult for other manufacturers to make that particular product. Okay, so that's the two groups that we find, two main groups that we focus on when we are looking at monopolies, that is natural and artificial as well. And then now we're going to look at the demand curve of the monopolist. And now that we've looked at the two main groups that we find or that we deal with in most cases. So under perfect competition, the individual producer faces a horizontal demand curve where D equals to MR and equals to AR, since it is a price taker. Okay, so we're going to be looking at a demand curve for that in terms of under perfect competition. What would be the trend, or what would the demand curve look like? So by contrast, the monopolists faces a nominal market demand curve which slopes downwards from left to right. So here D will equal to AR. We're going to have a look at that just now in terms of the curve, but I want us just to first go over this information. It is also the market or industry's demand curve, since the monopolist is responsible for the entire output of the industry. Remember, they are the sole provider, and therefore they are responsible for the entire output of that industry. Okay, all right, so now we will look at how the slope looks like. We see there that it goes downwards, from the left to right, and so we'll look at that because now we are looking at the price taker in terms of demand. So let's have a look at our graph, but then let's just get more details before we do so. So the marginal revenue curve of a monopolist, since a monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve, its marginal revenue curve and its demand curve are not the same curve as in the case with the individual producer under perfect competition. So remember, it's very different when we look at, perfect competition and imperfect competition, because the conditions for perfect competition are very different to the conditions that we find in the imperfect market. So it does make it difficult, because here you have the forces of the market determining the price. But when we look at imperfect competition, it's not the forces of demand and supply that determine the price. It's the different barriers that are put in place in that market that would actually determine the price. The fact that you've got an individual firm that dominates the market, that on its own determines the price, because they know that they are the price makers, and we as consumers then become the price takers, because we can't influence the prices, because we know that that manufacturer dominates the industry because they formed a merger with other companies and then in a position where they've become so powerful that they will influence the market price. Under perfect competition, the individual producer is a price taker and can sell any quantity at the market price, and therefore faces a horizontal demand curve, which is also its marginal revenue curve. Okay, this is still under perfect competition. So because we're looking at perfect competition, you can sell any quantity that you want on the mark, based on the market price, obviously, because if you sell below the market price, then you're not going to maximize your profits. And then when you sell above your market price, we know that you're going to lose customers, because you are charging them an amount that is based above the market price. So this is still under the perfect conditions, or the perfect conditions of perfect competition. So the demand curve for a monopolist, which is a downward sloping, implies that if it wishes to increase its sales by an additional unit, it must decrease the price of the product. So this is still under a perfect condition, or perfect competition. So if they want to increase sales, then they have to decrease the price in order to increase the sales volumes or get an additional unit in terms of sales. So there is that relationship between the quantity and the price. So you want to sell more products, you want to increase the quantity, and therefore you have to consider decreasing the price. So the lower price applies to all its customers. Its marginal revenue, that is the amount by which total revenue increases if it sells an additional unit, will therefore be less than the price. Okay, so hence we always say it's best that you sell at market price, because at this point, that is where you're going to maximize all your profits. Because what's the point of selling under your market price and not maximizing on the profits, or selling above the market price and then losing customers, because then they will find your products to be slightly more expensive, and then they will consider using the services of other manufacturers or suppliers. All right, so now we need to go back. In our last lesson, we spoke about the nominal profit and the economic profit. So now we're going to look at the output profit and loss. And we have, so the first thing that we're going to focus on is revenue. And then we've got our graph over here that is going to assist us in understanding the output that happens under a monopoly market. So we know that the market price will be determined on the upper part of the average revenue curve. So we've got our average revenue over here. So that's where we're going to get our market price. So we'll come back to this, but there are just a few points that I want us to consider before we look at what the market price is. So there are quite a few things that are happening in our graph. So please just note them down whilst we are going through this lesson. So we know that the demand curve for a monopolist is the market demand curve, and it slopes downwards from left to right. Okay, so we will see that, and then we're going to go back to figure 7.1, and then we're going to look at the demand curve. And then any point on the curve, or any point on the curve, is an indication of the quantity of the product to be sold and the price at which trade takes place. Okay, so that is that any point, okay, on the curve indicates the quantity of the product to be sold and also the price which trade takes place. Okay, so that is our second point. We'll go to the graph to identify that. Any price quantity combination on the demand curve is also its average revenue curve. Okay, so that is the price quantity. We'll go and establish that. And then the average revenue from each product is calculated by dividing the total revenue by the quantity, which will then be equals to price. And then figure 7.1 will show us all of this. So before we go back to the graph to identify all these points that we have just mentioned, let us take a short break, and then I will catch you right after this.